Now, my name is Cassie Fabio, and I am the Curriculum and Research Manager at Campus Vote Project. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm so excited to have you all here tonight. This is our political professions panel, where monthly, usually the last Monday of every month, we invite different professionals that do jobs that are politically related, oriented, have something to do with politics to come talk to our students at Campus Vote Project about what that job is really like, how they can be prepared to join that job, things like that. If you are a student and you're like, wow, this is so cool, I want to be part of this planning process, please feel free to join in our Student Voting Network Slack. We have a channel that's called Political Professions Panel. Look for it and you can join and help us plan. That is what Sadia and that is what Jenna did. And now they are hanging out with us tonight. So the other housekeeping thing I wanted to remind everyone of is that if you need closed captioning, you should be able to access it by going to more. And then there's like a thing that says closed captioning. That's why when you logged in, it says it's live streaming. My closed captioning service that I have says it's live streaming. It's not actually live streaming anywhere. So with no further ado, I am going to turn it over to Jenna and Sadia.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us. I am super excited about this panel because this is one of my fourth or fifth panels, but this is Sadia's first panel. So everybody make sure to give her lots of love and support. Thank you, as always, for joining us. And before we get started and before I let Sadia introduce herself to y'all, I just wanted to remind you guys that during the panel, feel free to ask questions in the chat and we will be doing student questions at the end. So Sadia, would you like to introduce yourself to everyone?
Hi, my name's Sadia and I'm a first year democracy fellow with CVP and I go by she, her pronouns.
Awesome. So without further ado, I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves with our first question. So please take a moment to introduce yourselves, state your name, where you work, and what you're responsible for in your journalism role. So I think Pam unmuted. So Pam, if you'd like to go first.
Hi, so my name is Pam Fessler, and for 28 years, I was at National Public Radio. I have just retired. For many of those years, for most of those years, I was a correspondent. Most recently, I covered voting issues and poverty issues as well. Before that, I also covered Homeland Security as well as voting. And I was also the elections editor for NPR about like in the late 1990s. So I've done a lot of political reporting. And before that, I worked at Congressional Quarterly magazine and covered Congress. So also did a lot of political reporting and election reporting.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We're so happy to have you here. Rachel, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, my name is Rachel Janfaza. I am a reporter at CNN where I'm on their digital politics team, so just stuff that's for the website. And I mostly cover young voters. So I've talked a lot about Campus Vote Project and what goes on college campuses across the country, as well as other student voting initiatives. And then I also serve on the breaking news desk a few days a week, which in that capacity, I cover all different types of things. But most of the time I'm talking to and about young people.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your very important work. Sam, would you like to go next?
Hi, everyone. I'm Sam Levine. I'm a voting rights reporter at The Guardian, where I cover voting rights, and that includes everything from voter ID, gerrymandering, felon disenfranchisement, litigation over voting rules. I work closely with our politics reporters. I've been there almost 2 years now. I started at the end of 2019. And before that, I was at HuffPost for 5 years.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here. And lastly, Chris.
Hi, everyone. I'm Chris Benson. I work for NorthCentralPA.com and probably not as mainstream as a lot of the other, some of my colleagues have worked for. But we cover more people in central Pennsylvania than most of the print media that has been around for 100 years even. My previous role was content manager reporter. So when you see things that are for instance, on our website on CNN, news goes at a certain time, and we do it based on certain algorithms, like what's going to get a better, how many more clicks, and what's going to get a greater interest at that time. I mainly cover political reporting, a lot of community stuff, some national stuff, and I do freelance work for caracalreports.com. So I'm pretty new to the game for the most part compared to some people, but I'm pleased to be here.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to Sadia for our second question.
Yeah, so for the second question, we were wondering what made you decide to pursue journalism as a career?
Rachel, would you like to answer first?
Sure. So I always was interested in education as well as politics, but loved to write. And so I had just started writing throughout college. I freelanced. So I freelanced for places like Teen Vogue and MTV News and some other youth focused publications. And I had also interned at Vice News during a summer in college. And I decided that to merge all my interests, I thought that journalism would be the best career to pursue, and it sort of just happened naturally. And after that internship at Vice, I just fell in love with writing and being published and talking to sources all day long and working with editors. And so I sort of just one thing led to another, and I decided that journalism would be the path to go.
Awesome. Thank you. Chris, would you like to go next?
Hi, sure. So like I was explaining to you folks earlier, that I actually come from like a political background mostly. And like Rachel, I just kind of fell into journalism. I have been writing since I was a kid. In fact, that was always one of my dream goals besides being president of the United States and a lawyer. So only one of them have happened. And it was just a natural fit once it came around last year. And I've always had an interest in writing. I've always been published before. And so I can empathize with what Rachel was saying, because having come from more of a political type of background, like campaigns and all that kind of fun stuff, I used to think that, making a difference had to be in government. When I found out, you know what, you can have more influence by writing and influencing thoughts and other people's actions. And that's ultimately what led me to journalism. And that's why I think I found my niche, as some people have said. So that's what led me here.
Awesome. Thank you. Pam, would you like to answer?
Sure. Yeah. So I was interested in journalism from basically from about third grade on, believe it or not. I've always wanted to be a reporter. Now, when I was young, really newspapers were the only option. There was a little bit of TV, but mostly it was newspapers. And same thing like Rachel and Chris, I just love to write. The other thing I love to do is just talk to people. And I was actually very shy. And journalism kind of gave me an opportunity, like an excuse to go ask people questions. I mean, I was just intrigued with what people thought and what their lives were like. And so the combination of that and writing, and also just an interest in current events, the combination, it seemed like journalism was just the best thing. And as I say, I was very young when I started getting interested. I worked on school newspapers. I had a neighborhood newspaper. When I went to college, I was the editor of the college newspaper, and I just went on from there. And I actually can't think of doing anything else. I mean, I absolutely love journalism, and I think it's one of the best jobs in the world.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That's so inspiring. And Sam.
Yeah, it's so funny to hear everyone else's answers, because I feel exactly the same way. I always love to write, and I was always someone who was interested in kind of a lot of different things. I never was like a math person or an arts person or an English person. Like I just was like curious and about kind of all of it. And when I started doing journalism, I actually started writing for like our local community paper. I grew up in New York City. I started writing for our local community paper in high school, and then continued to write for my paper in college. It kind of felt like I was cheating the system. Like I got to do this job where I just got to be curious about everything. And I got to ask people questions, kind of like Pam was saying, and they would respond to me. I realized I've realized over the years that I'm like a very nosy person, and I think that being a journalist is like the best profession for that, because you have an excuse to go out and find out what's going on. And even if it's something small you notice, like um, in college, I remember there was a movie projector on campus that was always breaking and people were always getting upset. And I remember like I could go and figure out like why was that happening, and what were they doing to fix that. And so I've always felt like I've kind of found this hack in the system for getting to pursue all of these different little things that I'm interested in, and having an excuse to ask people questions and having them answer me.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. Thank you all for those answers. Our next question is, what does a typical day look like for you? So Chris, if you'd like to start with this one.
One of the things I was told when I first got into this is there really is no such thing as a typical or a normal day or like the same day over and over. It's always a different day, because the news is always ever changing. So by that nature, so is your job. So for me to describe a typical day, I can describe processes, which is, you're looking at your inbox, seeing what's actually in the news, talking to people, trying to find some leads and some scoops. So it's like an ongoing process, at least for me anyway. But to be honest, there really is no such thing as a typical day. And that's probably one of the things that makes it the most fascinating, because you're not doing the same thing every single day. It's not mundane. There's nothing mundane about it. But it's just always something interesting going on. So no such thing as a typical day in a nutshell.
Awesome. Thank you. I don't know if everybody else's answers are going to be the same, but Rachel, if you'd like to go next.
Well, I have to say I do agree with Chris that no single day is the same. I think at the beginning, I sort of I've been at CNN now since 2020 when I graduated college. So I was expecting to have, a format to like how I would go about reporting out each story. And to a certain extent, it's similar where once you have an idea for a story, pitch it to an editor, get the go ahead, or most of the time not. There's probably for every 10 stories I pitch, maybe one gets picked up. And so you call the sources, you look into what is happening on the ground, you then file a draft, you then get feedback from your editor. So there is sort of a routine to it, but at the same time, each story, the reporting process is different. And sometimes stories come to you where people will, let you know what's going on or give you an idea. And then other times you entirely have to seek it out yourself. So I think, as Chris was saying, there's no one way that this happens, and each day is extremely different, but it always involves talking to different people who are at the root of what's going on, where the action's happening, and then time at your computer, but also time either doing it remotely and talking to people over the phone, lots of different phone calls, or seeing what's happening on the ground. And it takes a lot of patience and also a lot of just like being on your phone constantly and seeing what's happening. But yeah, it's always every day is a different beast, I guess, but in a good way.
Awesome. Thank you. Sam, would you like to answer?
Yeah, I agree that every day there's no kind of typical day. I think I would say like my work is broadly just kind of divided up into 3 categories. There's what I would call like researching and kind of pitching. So, I spend a lot of time just reading as many stories about voting as I can. I have Twitter open on one screen, and I have, people voting related reporters that I follow, and I'm constantly looking at, what are they writing about? What are they tweeting about? And then I'm also reading local papers, in kind of key places like Pennsylvania, Florida, Arizona, Georgia, who have, unmatched kind of political coverage of their states. And that's often kind of the first place that I'm going to see an interesting kind of voting rights thing come up. And, maybe there'll be some detail in a story that's, halfway in the middle of the story that will really interest me, and that will spark an idea to follow up on. And then there are also sources that I've, developed over the years who I'm talking to try and get a sense of, what are the stories that I need to do kind of this week? What would be a story I could do kind of over the next 2 weeks? And what would be, a story I could do over the next month or 2 months? And I'm sure, as other reporters can relate to, can be a challenge kind of balancing all of those and figuring out which one should get your attention. So that's kind of the researching phase. And then reporting is, like Rachel mentioned, it's a lot of phone calls. It can be going out in the field on a reporting trip for a couple days. And that's really just gathering, as much as you can get to make a story richer. So when I'm reporting, especially if I'm reporting in the field, that's all I'm doing. I'm not worried about writing in the field unless it's kind of a breaking news story, like you need to have a story filed that day. But I'm really focused on trying to get details and kind of interviews that I wouldn't be able to get from my desk. And then writing is just, putting it all together, working, with an editor, going back and forth on drafts, figuring out, what more do I need for a story? What could make this stronger? And that takes up a substantial amount of time too. So those are kind of the three those are kind of three kind of loose categories I think of my work in.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that answer. It's super helpful. Pam, if you would like to answer last.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously I do or did until I retired a lot of what both Sam, Rachel, and Chris talked about. I think two other points I'd like to make, and one is when you cover a beat like voting, especially if you're covering it on the national level, it is a challenge because a lot of the stuff is going on at the local level. You have stuff that's going on, and that's where the interesting things are starting to bubble up. So, it is a challenge to find out, okay, what's going on in Pennsylvania, what's going on in Texas, what's going on in Arizona when you're not there. So like Sam, I would spend a lot of time doing a lot of reading, combing through the local papers, because it's the local reporters who are actually there day by day, and they're the ones who see these stories as they're emerging. And what I would like to try to do was see what the national trend was. What are the things that are going on in all these different places that are showing a new trend? And then because I was at NPR, my other challenge is always was sound and collecting sound and going out and reporting. So for me, the best stories were the feature stories that I did where I saw some kind of a trend that was going on. I would go to one place to kind of help illustrate this national trend. And like Sam, when I was there, I would spend my whole time, just gathering sound, interviewing people, trying to get scenes, just capture the moment, capture the event, and capture the emotion of what was going on, which was a whole different level or layer of reporting from what I did when I worked, say, at Congressional Quarterly, which was all print. The other thing I would say is that one of the wonderful things in reporting when you're going out into the field, inevitably, I would pick up 5 other stories I had no clue about. It would be a little snippet. It'd be one thing that somebody would say as an aside. And I think, okay, that's the next story I'm going to do. And those were all things that I wouldn't have picked up, maybe talking to somebody on the telephone or just, going through other, reading other stories. So I can't emphasize enough how wonderful and how great and how valuable it is as a journalist to go out in the field and to be with people in person.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
For the next question, how do you work to combat the stereotype that all journalism is biased? Sam, can you answer the first?
It's a good question. I think, it's something that I think I've gotten better at kind of and been able to deal with kind of more as I've advanced in my career. I think, early on when I was starting out and, when I would call someone, you'd be reporting a story and, I wasn't an expert at anything. So, I would get one person's perspective, I would get another person's perspective, and you kind of just lay that out in the story. And I think as I got more into covering voting rights, the challenge is that I started to encounter things and people would say things to me in interviews that you know I knew were just not true. I knew, you're looking at the data in a way that is, I can see why you're interpreting it that way or why you're saying that, but that's actually not an accurate representation of what this study is saying or what this data point is saying. So, as I became more of an expert, I think I developed kind of more of a confidence in presenting information to the reader, but also making it clear kind of what was true and why something was wrong. I don't think it, and the perspective I always come at it with is, my loyalty as a reporter is to the reader. Am I giving the reader the best kind of information that they need to understand this? Am I doing the best I can do to contextualize this, to explain this, and to give them a really fair reading of this, of whatever I'm presenting to them? So I think that can be extremely, extremely challenging. Are people who, will, how do you do something when, someone is saying something or there's a story that's based on something that's just not true? I think this is a challenge that, we're all kind of confronting more and more. And I think I am very careful about making sure that there's appropriate context, that when something isn't true, I lay out for the reader exactly, why I feel comfortable saying, this is inaccurate. And I probably overlink to like original documents and studies and court filings and things like that. Like if someone says something to me like, oh, it's based on this study, it's based on this survey, it's based on this analysis we did, I want to see the analysis and make sure that the reader can click through in my story to see that analysis. And at the end of the day, the question that I always kind of gut check myself with is this really, if I was a reader and I was coming to this, would it really be a fair representation of this story? Would I have all the information I need to make an accurate kind of assessment of what's being presented? And if I can get to that place, I feel pretty confident in putting out the story.
Thank you. And if Pam wants to go next.
Yeah, I would say one of the biggest things you need to do is just really know what you're talking about and what you're reporting on. I mean, you just have to, like Sam mentioned, in the beginning you felt, you didn't know the topic as well. So it leaves you as a journalist more vulnerable to people who are questioning your integrity, or not even so much questioning your integrity, but whether you're reporting things that might not be accurate. So it's just, again, you just, as a reporter, especially when you're covering a beat, you just have to really learn the ins and outs of every single thing. I mean, and question everybody. I mean, question, every number that anybody gives you, I think you have to question. You have to question it, whether it's, how many people are being thrown off the rolls because of a purge, of how many, how many people can't vote because of a new voter ID requirement. You really have to have people justify claims if you're going to report them. You can't just say they said this, and then the other side says this. And I think most reporters now covering voting issues are really quite good at that. over the past couple of years. I just think that it's gotten so much better than it was, 5-10 years ago, because there are so many more reporters now who are specifically covering this beat. The other thing I have always felt like even the people who are saying things that are incorrect, they're saying them for a reason, and I like to talk to them, and I listen to people. Why are they saying these things? There are many people out there who really do believe that the election was stolen. Who are they and why do they believe this and where are they getting their information? And you have to talk to them to find out why, because that's part of the story as well. Whether or not it's based on false information, there's some people who truly, truly believe it. And the question is why, and then what you can, how you would present the story.
Thank you. And if Chris wants to answer next.
Sure. I mean, that's a really good question. And frankly, I don't think we'll ever find an answer. But I mean, for me, and let's be honest, there really is such a thing as fake news. I choose not to live my career by it. But to combat the idea that journalism is biased, to kind of touch upon what Pam was saying, you got to know what you're talking about. You got to just speak the truth and just get it out there. Whether people believe it or not is entirely up to them. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink it. You know what I mean? So that's kind of like my approach, like just be as honest and straightforward as you can. Tell the story, get it out there. And hopefully in the long run, you just got to kind of hope that it takes and it does what it's supposed to do, which is what journalism is supposed to do, to tell the truth. So that's my approach.
Thank you. And Rachel for the last.
I think I agree with a lot of what Sam, Pam, and Chris had to say. What I would add is that in order to combat that stereotype, I think it's important just to try in the stories to get as many different perspectives in as possible without, clouding the story. You don't want to have it be like too many voices at once, but I think trying to also something, especially when talking to, so as I mentioned, I cover young voters specifically, and a lot of the loudest voices, or the people that get the most attention, that are young people, typically are the ones who are the most outspoken and the most active on their communities, in their communities, when it comes to politics and elections and voting. And so those people are probably pretty involved in politics. They are probably, they're either with their campus Democrats or Republicans or what have you, or their town, or they're running for office or whatever it is. And so what I try to do is talk to, and I try to improve on this all the time, but talk to just the average person who might not actually be as involved in the action, but are a voter and have concerns that they want to voice as well. And so talking to, just the everyday people who are still active participants in democracy, but might not be the leader of whatever organization they're a part of, I think is also really important. So I would just say, I try as best as I can to listen to all different types of voices. Also, I think when you're reporting out a story, it's important to talk to as many different types of people as possible, even if those voices don't make it into the ultimate story, because of space, and you can't have everyone. It's important to have as robust a discussion ahead of the publishing of the story as possible, so you just get a sense of what's going on. But I think that this is a challenge, and it's a great question, and it's something that in my job every day I think about, and try to work against it, and work to tell as best to paint as full a picture as possible.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for those wonderful answers. One of our last questions before we move on to audience questions is, what is one piece of advice that you would give to a student wanting to pursue journalism as a career? Pam, if you would like to answer first.
Yeah, I mean, I would say one of the best things to do is to start local, to get a job at a local publication or some kind of site. because I think that's where you're going to really learn how politics works, especially if you're interested in voting and elections and politics. And just covering local government offices, maybe a state legislature. I just think that's the way you can really get into a beat. And then you can use that to develop so that if you did go and get a job as a national reporter, you would have that base to work from, and you would understand that all these things, happen locally that are reflected around the country. I also think it's probably an easier way to start making contacts and getting sources. And also it's just so important. I mean, I don't think I can emphasize enough just how important local reporting is for democracy and for our country. The reporting, the best reporting that's been going on in the voting stuff, these reporters, in Arizona have been doing an amazing job on this, election. I'm going to go audit, and in Georgia and in Pennsylvania too, that, the local reporters have been just doing a wonderful job. And without them, we national reporters wouldn't know a lot of stuff that's going on. So that's my first, and also to get out in the field. It's too easy, and especially now because of the pandemic, we've all become way too used to it. But it's just, and the demands of the job are so great. Sometimes you do find yourself stuck at your desk and you're, have to use the phone all the time or email. But it's really when you go out in the field that you find out what's actually going on in the world.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Sam, would you like to answer?
Yeah, I agree with so much of what Pam said. And I would just add, I think especially when you're just starting out, I would encourage you to experiment with different mediums in journalism. I obviously work in print, but when I was in college, I interned for 2 summers in TV. And that, although, I'm not in broadcast journalism and I don't have the technical skills to put together a package or anything like that. I think there were certain skills that I picked up from TV that I don't know if I would have gotten, had I not done it. I learned, I watched kind of daily TV reporters quickly turn a story. They would be out all day reporting a story, and they would, write the 2-minute package for the 5 o'clock news. And I watched, how do you turn a story around really quickly? As an intern, I was kind of I worked for 2020 at ABC, and, one of my jobs was to kind of scour local papers looking for stuff that could be a national story on 2020, which is exactly kind of what, like Pam was talking about, the skill that I use every day. And I feel like also now in journalism, there's more of a blend. There's no such thing as a print reporter, a TV, video reporter, a radio reporter. The more you can do across all of those mediums, I think the more you can make yourself stand out as a journalist. And I think you'll really learn the different kinds of storytelling across all of those mediums that will make you a better journalist, no matter which one you kind of choose to focus on.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Chris, if you would like to answer next.
Sure. I mean, I would definitely defer to what a lot of what has been said here. I'm relatively new as far as journalism goes, as far as like an actual job, even though I've been doing writing and being in print for like the past almost 20 years. But I guess if I did add anything that has been said here, I would say, don't do it if you're in it for the money. You really got to have the passion for telling the story, and I'll use the word truth again, getting the truth out there, trying to change people's minds. That's what motivates me. I guess if that's what motivates you, then that's something that you should do. Because kind of like what Sam was saying, having different backgrounds and experiences and many different things, like I was mostly political and campaigns and stuff like that before I even got into this part of a different career. So to have that perspective it made it easier for me to transition. So, I guess don't be afraid to try something for a while and then go into something else similar but different, if that makes sense. So I guess if that's anything I'd add, just experimental. Don't be afraid to step out of your comfort zone. And it's sometimes a good thing.
Awesome, thank you. That's really good advice. And Rachel.
I agree with everything that's been said, but the other thing I would add is just don't be afraid to just start writing. If writing is the medium that you choose, or whatever, producing, whatever the medium you choose, just start creating content, build out stories, and then you can take those and pitch them to outlets, whether it be local or national outlets, and just pitch, and don't be afraid of rejection, because as I said before, I cannot tell you how many times my story has been shot down, and then you either pitch a new one or you work on a version of that and create a better version. But just don't be afraid to take the risk and just start creating the content, and it'll go from there. But I think the best thing you can do is just ask, as Sam said in the beginning, it's all about curiosity and just asking lots of questions. And I think that, you know, if you have that bug inside of you and you want to be in the know, and you ask all the people all the questions you can, you're gonna find something, and then just put pen to paper and go from there.
Actually, can I just
Awesome.
add one other thing
Yeah.
quickly? And it was because of what Chris was talking about, how he went from politics into journalism. I also went into government for a while. I worked as a newspaper reporter in New Jersey, and then I actually got a master's of public administration. I went to work for the government for a year, just quite frankly to see, because I'd always been interested in journalism. I wanted to see what other things were out there. And then I immediately went back into journalism. But it was a great experience. You know, I think that you can get a lot by trying something new, you know, doing something different. I don't completely write off getting a job in some other area, even if it's a short period of time, just because it gives you a whole different perspective. You know, when you're as a journalist, you get a little bit more insight into how other people operate. So I found it very helpful, quite frankly.
Awesome. Thank you so much for adding that. So now we are going to move on to audience questions. If y'all have questions, put them in the chat. And after, if we have time, we'll just go through them and we'll see where we get. So our first question is from Ashton, and she asks, sometimes there's been situations where I've been scolded for using social media to be updated on recent stories and events. What are some of your processes for filtering through what is good and not so good when it comes to news stories? So Rachel, if you'd like to answer first. I know it's a lot to digest, so if y'all need a second, take your time.
No, and it's a really good question. I think it's really important to be really vigilant when you're on your social media feed, to you know, be able to sort out what is happening. But I do think social media can be a great place to get news, especially if you're trying just to get a pulse on what people in your own community are feeling. And if you're, let's say you're a college student and you're on campus and students start talking about how they're frustrated with, I remember when I was on campus, the dining hall workers went on strike, and that was, people were talking about it, at both students, and they were getting perspectives from the actual workers who were striking. And so that really the only place to find that out was on Twitter and on talking and seeing on Instagram. People are putting this on their stories and everything. And so I do think that you can get news, especially local news, from social media. And then in terms of, you know, getting news stories, like where you're reading your news, I mean, I think just taking everything with a grain of salt and understanding that while it might be one story, it might not be the whole story. But I do think social media can be a great place to learn about what's going on, especially in your own community.
Awesome, thank you. Sam, if you'd like to answer.
Yeah, I mean, I think social media can be an amazing tool for gathering news, but you have to be really careful. When I was at HuffPost, I started on the breaking news desk, and we had lots of situations where we were relying on Twitter for, you know, very fast-moving events happening. I remember covering the protests in Ferguson, Missouri, and using Twitter to follow what was going on, school shootings, where you following what's going on Twitter. And some good habits I think I picked up is we were always taught, first you have to pay attention to who is tweeting it. Is it a random person on Twitter, or is it, the Associated Press, or a reporter with the AP or New York Times or NPR, and kind of waiting, is this someone or a news source that I trust? And even then, I like to have at least more than one person confirming something if I can't confirm it myself. So, I think you can use it to look for confirmation. Sometimes I'll use it to say, okay, like these people are reporting this. Can I make a phone call just to verify this for myself? And I think another thing is just, taking a step back in those very kind of high pressure moments to say, like, it's more important to get this right than to be the very first news outlet that has this. I think, sometimes, there's going to be editors who want something ASAP, and really taking just that extra 30 seconds maybe to make a phone call, look for another confirmed source, explaining to your editor, I don't know if this is 100% verified yet. I don't feel comfortable. And yeah, you just really building in kind of checks to how you're using it to gather information. And also just using it as a launching point to start your own reporting, and to follow up on things, to see if you can confirm it yourself.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Chris, would you like to go next?
I would agree with everything that Sam and Rachel had said. You got to be really vigilant, especially if you're a journalist, on where this information is coming from. Because we talk about, fake news and integrity of journalism. If the journalist himself is not being careful in the news where they're getting information, then it has a spiral effect, and that's what we don't want. That's what questions the integrity of journalism. So being vigilant in all the information, where it's coming from, what you know, whatnot. I think that's probably the most integral part that you could probably do. Short answer, but sweet. So there you go.
Awesome. Thank you. And lastly, Pam.
I think at NPR it was a little bit different because we didn't have the same pressure for breaking news as I think some of the other journalists have. So we would very rarely get something just from social media. It would only be, that might be the lead, okay, we need to follow up on that and definitely get it verified from another source. I personally use social media for, I kind of two categories of people that I would follow. There'd be the people that are kind of the mainstream solid news sources that I felt like, I could totally depend on, like Sam or AP or others or CNN, that would, maybe keep me on top of things that maybe I wasn't following directly. Then the other group would be, I followed the whole range of ideological sources. So I would so it would give me a sense of what people on the left were talking about, and definitely people on the right, what they were talking about. And it was just an opportunity for me to get a sense of what the conversation was. And that would basically provide a lead for me to do stories and then start doing my own reporting. So I very rarely would get something just from social media and report it. The only times maybe we might do that is, say there was a major disaster going on somewhere and the fire department had a tweet and they said, blah, 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 this is what's happening, that type of thing. But for the most part, NPR really didn't do that kind of reporting, so it wasn't as much of an issue.
Thank you for all those answers. And Raymond in the chat has asked, can one of the panelists describe the toughest story or situation they've had to write or deal with in the industry? If Rachel wants to answer first.
Um, I don't have one that immediately pops to my head on first thought. So I don't know if any of the other panelists have any that pop into their head, but
I mean, this is not really related to voting, but I would say that, I covered poverty was the other issue. And I spent a lot of time with families. So to try and illustrate a lot of the stories about some of the issues that low-income families in America face, I'd often get connected with a family or an individual who was going through a lot of trying times. And I always felt kind of a conflict of, we want to use their names. And I felt like sometimes the people, even though I would try and explain, I'm doing this story, it's going to be on the radio, and we're going to probably have a story on the web, that they might not understand completely what kind of exposure that was giving to them. And I tried to be as open. To me, that was the most difficult, because I didn't want to basically screw these people who were opening up basically their souls to me in many ways, and all their personal information. So I think, journalists just have to be very, very careful how we use people to tell stories. And there's a lot of responsibility in that you have to be as fair. You're trying to help inform the public, but you also don't want to hurt the individuals who are sharing their stories. So to me, that's always been the most difficult part of my job.
Thank you, Pam. And if Chris wants to answer next.
I mean, I can kind of empathize with what Pam was saying. I don't think I've had much time in the field enough to really give a finite answer to that. But what I can say is, for a story that I've been working on since I started, without going into too much detail, full disclosure, by the way, I'm not a Republican, but I deal with a lot of Republicans because in my neck of the woods, that's the majority of them. So I have no choice but to put my own personal feelings and opinions aside. And that's not always easy. So for instance, what I have been working on, so our county commissioners, two Republicans and one Democrat, there's this weird power struggle going on. And let me put it to you this way: corruption is real. So when you have someone that's honest, that is saying something different publicly, but is saying something real privately, you really do got to try and find that balance. And I could not emphasize the phrase OTR enough off the record. It's been very friendly to me. So I'm not sure if that answers the question, but I think you'll find like a lot of moral dilemmas, I guess, you'll come across probably every now and then, depending on what you're covering, what your interests are and whatnot. Just kind of my perspective a little bit.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. And if Sam wants to go next.
I wish I had a specific example. I mean, there's so many stories where, someone in the story, and this applies across the ideological spectrum, someone or their press person is really unhappy with the story, some fact in the story that something, got cut, or they're not happy with how it's framed, and they're going to call you and email you, and they want to talk to your boss, and they're really upset, and you calling you is not unprofessional, but you're not a good reporter, and how could you frame it this way, and blah blah blah. And I think, again, when you're just starting out, that feels terrible. You're coming to it new, and you might have screwed something up, and you have to develop just kind of a thick skin to it. I think before you put out the story, I think you have to get to a point where you feel confident in the story and recognize that you're likely to get a phone call like that. Talk it over with your editor before it goes out, and really get to the point at the end of the day where you feel bulletproof, that your story is bulletproof, and not take it kind of personally as a reporter. And there are people that don't forget that they were unhappy with the story. I think there's one one press person who's very unhappy with a story that I did like 5 years ago and still refuses to talk to me. But that's fine. Like, I feel confident in the story. There was nothing wrong in the story, and I understand why this person is upset with it. It didn't make their boss look particularly good. But I felt it was a story that was worth writing. I think just something Chris said made me think about, off the record on background is, I think, an increasingly difficult area for journalists to navigate. I think there's a lot of discussion among reporters about when it's appropriate to use that, when it's ethical to use that. I think most reporters would acknowledge that it's probably overused, especially in Washington. People are allowed to talk without giving their names when they really shouldn't, when they really should have to be quoted by name, just to kind of trash someone or make it for whatever agenda they might have. And I think that when you have access to someone, or someone's only going to give you a quote because if they're allowed to talk on background, then that's really difficult. I've had government spokespeople who are giving the most bland information, like literally the most boring information you've ever heard, and they only want to be quoted as a blank department official, only attributable to that. And there's no reason you couldn't say their name or say that they're a spokesperson. And I just, in my own reporting personally, have tried to take a harder line on that. I try to really only let someone speak anonymously if it's really worth it, if I really need their quote in the story, if it can be justified. But I think that navigating when to let someone talk without giving their name can be a really difficult territory for a lot of journalists.
I know I didn't have a specific one before, and it's still not specific, but I would just jump back in and say that I think, especially as a young journalist, someone who is new to this and has relatively little experience compared to some of the more veteran journalists who are in the field, I find it to be a constant challenge to make sure that I don't want to mess anything up. Like I don't want whether it be a spelling error or a quote. And so I think just the stress of checking and triple checking and making sure that you are paying attention to those little details. And it's one thing that I sometimes struggle with is like, I don't want to bother a source and ask them for confirmation on the same piece of information over and over again. But sometimes if I feel a little bit hesitant, did I hear that correctly? Is that the right number? Is that too high or too low? Just continuing to check. And also, of course I've made mistakes, and I probably will continue to. And that's, even though, this is an industry where it's very public when that happens, it is okay, but you learn from each mistake. And so I think just it's a constant, something that I stress about on a daily basis, is just making sure that I'm being diligent in the little details.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for those answers. We have one final question before we wrap up. Mike wants to know if you guys have any tips for student voting advocates to get their perspectives included in news coverage. Chris, if you'd like to go first.
Sure. I mean, honestly, that's exactly how I started when I was 15 years old. I was a young, enthusiastic, politically interested person at 14 years old. And to touch upon what was said with a lot of stuff here, like I just started sitting in front of my computer and typing away my opinions about issues and stuff like that. So we're talking like 2003, 2004. And then something as simple as submitting it to a letter to the editor, that's being published. That's a way to start. That's the way to build your brand, to hone in on your own writing skills. So I guess if that's the only place I would say to really just kind of start out, to kind of touch upon what Rachel was saying earlier, just sit in front of your computer and just start typing. If that's what inspires you, and just start submitting, and don't be afraid of rejection. Especially these days, a lot of reporters are very interested in understanding what younger people are saying, what's going on at local level, especially what happens in campaigns and voting efforts. So I guess that would be my only suggestion. Just start writing and just start submitting and start making connections. If you're out and about in the community, you know a couple of reporters, they're more prone to talk to you. So for whatever that's worth. Hope that answers your question.
Awesome, thank you. Pam, would you like to give any tips for
Sure.
voting?
Yeah, I'd say, and Chris talked about it a little bit, but I would say definitely just get to know the reporters in your area who cover this stuff. You know, get to know them on a personal basis so that you're not just wanting them to cover something when you have something specific to be covered. You need to develop a relationship so they'll know to come to you when they're doing a story, say, about what young voters think. Maybe invite the reporter to come and be at one of your meetings or follow you along, say, hey, this would be a great story to do, you know, to just follow what we do, what our campaign is like. Because reporters always like to get kind of inside looks at how different things work and what different groups are doing. So I just really think that personal connection, having it not when there's a breaking story, but long term, makes all the difference.
Awesome, thank you. Rachel, would you like to go next?
Sure. I would echo what both Chris and Pam said and say just reach out to journalists and introduce yourself and just get to know them. And don't be afraid to cold email people. And whether this is about the work that you're doing and you want you want to get to know the reporter on that level, or if you're for career wise too, if journalism is something that you're interested in pursuing and want to hear about someone's perspective or how they got into it, I think cold emailing people, what's the worst thing that happens is they don't respond. So I think just trying to get to know them is a great way to start. And I think the fact that you guys are engaged and paying attention to this type of stuff, people are really going to be curious to hear where your interest comes from and why you're passionate about it. And just don't hesitate to reach out.
Awesome, thank you. And Sam.
Yeah, just building what Pam was saying, I think, getting to know, following, the reporters kind of in your area and, what are they writing about? And if you see a story that, seems relevant to something you're seeing or something you're experiencing or working on, framing it in that way, hey, Sam, I saw you wrote about, how this new law is really hurting voter registration. Actually, we're really seeing that on campus. And I'd love to show you how, do you have a minute? Could I talk to you for a minute about it? Kind of linking it to trying to understand what is this reporter focusing on, and am I seeing something that fits into that? I think will grab their attention very easily. Yeah, that would be my advice.
Awesome, thank you all so much for that advice. And again, thank you all for being here. We really appreciate it and really appreciate all of the advice that y'all gave. I'm going to turn it back over to Cassie to close us out.
First of all, Sadia, first moderating ever. Congratulations. Round of applause for you. Thank you. Jenna, pro at this point. She was a first timer when we had our elected officials on. So I think we're just trying to make this the most high stakes for our first time moderators as possible. And I want to thank each and every one of our journalists on today. I think that my students know this, but I was a journalist before I started going to get my PhD program. So my heart is very happy right now. I just want to thank y'all. I know how hectic your schedules can be. So much, much appreciated. I'm going to throw a tip out there since y'all are interested in getting coverage, my students, you are, when myself or Cola our communications director reaches out to you and says, we have a journalist interested in talking, they're typically on some kind of time constraint. and we're already the in-between person. So answer as fast as possible if you want to be featured. That's my really practical piece of advice for y'all is look at the messages that Kola and I are sending you if you really do want to be featured in the news. So next month, we will be featuring political analyst on our political professions panel. Again, if you want to be part of that planning process, feel free to join our political professions panel planning Slack in the Student Voting Network. If you aren't sure where the SVN Slack is, just drop it in the chat and I will get that information to you. And last, in half an hour, if you're like, wow, I'm feeling very pumped about this, but I want to do research. Maybe I want to research how journalists are covering local student activists. Come hang out with us at the CVP Research Collective, where we are doing research, obviously, because it's in the title. You can tell it's late for me, but where we are going to be talking about hopefully publishable research for our students. So that space is available too tonight in about half an hour. It has already been bumped on Slack as well. So thank you again, everyone, and have a really wonderful evening.
Thank you all so much.